this, Andy, why don't you think felons should have their voting rights?
Well, I mean, if I could
restored
ask, and if that's if you disagree, that's fine. But I would appreciate, and I think the audience would appreciate it if Sarah kind of introduced briefly what it is she's proposing first, if I may.
I have no problem with that. What's the skinny, Sarah?
Well, the skinny is pretty simple. Minnesota is one of the most restrictive states regarding voting rights. And what we are proposing is that right now in Minnesota, you are not able to vote if you are on probation, parole, or in prison. The net result is we have one of the highest disenfranchisement rates of people in the United States. And the Restore the Vote Coalition is proposing that we change our law to make it so that people who are living in the community, paying taxes, raising their families, and are on probation and parole have their rights restored. This is what 13 other states do, and in fact, Maryland just is passing a law to allow people in the community to vote, and we think it's past due given the over-criminalization and the fact that the criminal justice system has expanded so much, and we don't believe this was the intended effect.
Okay, so as it is now, somebody has their voting rights restored if they're a felon when they're done with probation.
That is correct. If they're done with probation or
done
parole,
with prison.
Yes. Well, we don't think people in prison should vote. We think that they are, outside of civil society, and we've deemed as a society that they're too dangerous to be interacting with government in many ways. So we think that is a completely reasonable position. Even though 2 states in this country do allow prisoners to vote, and every other Western democracy, but we don't think that's reasonable. We think that people who are in the community, again, they're in the community paying taxes, but we have the longest periods of probation in the United States and Minnesota, the 4th highest rate of people on probation in the United States.
Okay. There you are, Andy.
All right. Well, no,
What's wrong with that?
I appreciate that. Well, there's a lot wrong with it. I mean, we are not one of the most restrictive states. We're one of the most lax. In fact, with same-day registration, almost 600,000 people come walking in to our elections each and every presidential year unchecked. But she talks about most states having more restrictive laws regarding felons. Most states do not allow felons to vote. In fact, some of them, including Iowa, Virginia, Kentucky, and Florida, restrict felons voting for life. Minnesota doesn't do that, which we think is a good policy here in Minnesota. But what Sarah mostly has shown here is that almost all of her concern is with the felon, and she largely ignores the impact on the Constitution, the law-abiding citizens, and elections. In Minnesota, felons already have a second choice, as I just mentioned, where convicted felons lose the right to vote for life in those many states. When they complete their sentences here in Minnesota, they can vote. What Sarah is really asking is for a second risk to law-abiding citizens. I have 4 points that I'd like to share with you, Jack and Andrew, the audience. The first one, this is why we think it's a bad idea to allow felons to vote here in Minnesota prior to them finishing their complete sentences. Number 1 is we believe it's unconstitutional. Number 2, it's harmful to law-abiding citizens. Number 3, it's being pushed for passage largely out of public view. And number 4, it's a...
Whoa. I understand we don't have the largest audience, Andy, but we are in the public view right now.
Well, specifically at the legislative angle, there has not been a lot of hearings. Jack, most people that I've talked to have not even been aware of this issue. There has not been a lot of testimony down at the Senate. In fact, the Senate hearing I watched the other day on tape with Walter Hudson, there was not even an opponent in the entire Senate hearing.
Okay.
And so that's kind of what I mean. I don't mean to be disrespectful to your large audience.
Okay, well, I would really love to.
We get to number 4.
Let me get through my first point. Pardon?
Oh, did we get through number 4?
You get all 4. You had 4 points.
Well, I want to just mention unconstitutional, harmful to law-abiding citizens, largely out of public view at the Capitol, and this is nothing more than a partisan strategy.
All right, partisan strategy is number 4.
What I'd like to do is just introduce the constitutional argument and then discuss.
That's the first one I'd like to have you expand on. How is it unconstitutional?
Okay, Article 7, Section 1 says felons may not vote in Minnesota unless they're restored to civil rights. For more than 150 years, this has meant and continues to mean the full length of their sentences. They are not restored to civil rights simply by being released from prison. There has been no real discussion in the legislature of the constitutionality of this change to law. It has been conveniently ignored. In our view, this proposed law is clearly unconstitutional. If this change to the law is passed, it will likely end up in court. Here's the key, Jack. The legislature simply does not have the discretion to insert language into the Minnesota Constitution. This is a separation of powers issue. An initiative such as this requires a constitutional amendment where all the voters of Minnesota can weigh in.
Sarah?
Yes, well, I'll just say he's absolutely wrong on the constitutional argument. The Constitution in Article 7, Section 1, what it actually says is it does define, it says the Minnesota State Legislature is allowed to define what a sentence is. And then there's something that we use often in Minnesota, which is called enabling language. And it's the enabling language, which is statutory and not constitutional, which defines what a sentence is. And I will go back, for someone who seems so concerned about the Constitution, he's totally forgetting about constitutional intent. Because at the founding of our state constitution, there was absolutely no system of probation or parole. What sentence meant when the enabling language was written was meant actually a prison system. And at the time of our state constitution, we had 36 people in prison. And there was not even a concept or idea of probation or parole until the early 1900s, or a well-developed sense of it. But I'm hoping I can respond to some of his other concerns, which just seem, I would say, unreasonable, unless...
Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I wanted to bring up, part of the argument is that we have extensive periods of parole and probation in Minnesota. Wouldn't the battle be easier fought to work to get probation and parole sentences shortened?
Well, I would say there's a few things. So absolutely. I mean, and this is something else I work on. And there have been numerous proposals this year to look at drug sentencing reductions. And I've seen many people, including legislators, advocates from the Minnesota Voters Alliance, in fact, have made this argument themselves that they'll say, well, you know what we should do? We should look at reforming the criminal justice system. I've heard Dan McGrath from your organization say that the problem, in fact, is with the war on drugs and over incarceration. Well,
I think you'll find a lot of common ground in the over criminalization argument and the sentencing guidelines being a little out of proportion of what they should be.
Absolutely, and we've been working on these issues for, I would say, a decade now in Minnesota. But the problem is that there's a logical incongruence with that argument. You're basically acknowledging that the criminal justice system is broken and that we incarcerate too many people. And that suggests that we're not incarcerating or putting on probation the people we need to, but then we're saying they're so dangerous they can't vote. So you can't really hold one thing that's saying we've caught too many people unnecessarily in the criminal justice system, but then say you can't vote.
Say those same people shouldn't be able to vote.
You know, Andrew, and that's a good point. This is typical liberal way of ignoring the Constitution. When Sarah talks about defining sentences, that is nothing to do with Article 7, Section 1. When the courts define the sentences and sentence an individual to a period of either prison and or probation, that is it. That person has to serve that time. Right. And until that...
hang on one second. I've got the Constitution right in front of me. The following person shall not be entitled or permitted to vote at any election in this state. A person not meeting the above requirements, a person who has been convicted of treason or a felony, unless restored to civil rights. But wouldn't this be, if passed by statute, a restoration of those civil rights, thus making
how can you insert the right to vote without dealing with the civil rights? They have to relieve them of their sentences before they let them vote.
Let's take Mark. He's in Minneapolis and an attorney who's researched this topic. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. Yes, the claim that this change would be unconstitutional is absolutely false. I've been studying this issue for several years now, and as you just read, Jack, the Constitution says, unless restored to civil rights. And that's the constitutional provision that allows the legislature to decide when those rights are restored. And the proposal we are making that is being made would allow those rights to be restored upon release from incarceration rather than upon discharge from sentence. It's very simple, and I just don't know why they...
Right. But the key is, it doesn't say unless the voting rights are restored. The key is civil rights. So I disagree with Mark. I don't think he's going the right direction.
Sarah?
I need to address something, too, just about the idea that we have not done this in the public and somehow this has gone, under the radar. It seems really hard to make that argument when, in fact, the Star Tribune, the Pioneer Press, the Rochester Post-Bulletin, and the St. Cloud Times have all, in the last few months, done op-eds. Right. I can count countless radio interviews, not just here and other ones. This is also not the first time we've had a hearing on this over the last decade. And in fact, we had a huge turnout at the Senate Senate hearings. In addition, it is not our responsibility to make sure that you show up at the Capitol.
Right.
Although
Right.
Thanks,
and-
Mark.
No, that's right.
Appreciate your
No,
expertise.
as of late, it has been getting more press. I agree with you.
Andy, do you agree or disagree with the notion that the phrase the restoration of civil rights part of that statute, there's room for negotiation there, there's room for interpretation?
This has been vetted by.
I want to get Andy's response first.
I don't believe so. I said unless restored to civil rights. We interpret that, and it has the meaning all the way back since the Minnesota Constitution was formed, that restored to civil rights, it's in the Democrat early session laws, also the Republican early session laws from 1857, that's obviously what they meant. That's what we've done for 150 years.
Mm-hmm.
When that person finishes and completes their sentence, then they are allowed to vote. And I believe that in the final analysis, that in court, it'll be decided that unless restored to civil rights means when they complete their sentence.
How can you argue that it was the intent when there was no system of probation and parole and the only meaning of sentence was, in fact, incarceration?
And we'll get that answer after the break. We're talking with Andy Cilek with Minnesota Voters Alliance and Sarah Walker with the Second Chance Coalition and Restore the Vote Minnesota. If you've got thoughts, give us a call, 651-989-5855.
Up and at 'em now. Glenn Beck next at 9.
On Twin Cities News Talk, AM 11.